Jack Reynolds had stopped expecting life to surprise him. In his mid-40s, he worked the night shift as a rideshare driver in the suburbs of Chicago. His world had grown small: a rusted-out Toyota, long stretches of silence on the freeway, and an old townhouse where his ailing mother waited with the TV on low. Once he had dreams. Now he had bills, and a sense that time was quietly running out. The evening it happened was cold and unremarkable. A new ride request pinged through his phone. Pickup, Lakeshore Drive. Drop-off, Evanston. He hesitated. Something about the late hour made him think twice, but he hit accept. When she stepped into the back seat, she didn't look like someone who belonged in a rideshare. Grace Whitmore, mid-70s, poised, elegant. A woman who looked like she carried a story she hadn't told in a very long time. What began as polite chatter about traffic slowly became something else. She asked him about his life, his regrets, what he thought he'd be doing by now. Jack answered without thinking, and in doing so, something shifted. A few days later, he learned she had died, and then came the letter. Grace had left behind a fortune, and a surprise. Jack had been written into her will. No explanation, no warning, just an invitation into a world he never imagined. The estate, the lawyers, the family she never spoke of, and a legacy that would force Jack to question everything he believed about his own past. What follows is a journey through grief, inheritance, betrayal, and the quiet redemption of a man who thought his story was already over. So let me ask you, have you ever felt invisible to the world, only to find out someone was watching you all along? Do you believe a single conversation, a moment of true connection, could change everything? And, more importantly, what would you do if life offered you one last, unexpected second chance? If this made you reflect, if it made your chest tighten just a little, subscribe to the channel, because the next story might feel even closer to home. It had been raining since just after dawn. A slow, steady kind of rain that didn't ask to be noticed, but refused to be ignored. Inside a large, weathered estate nestled at the edge of Evanston, Illinois, Grace Whitmore sat in a high-backed armchair by her window. The room around her was hushed, filled with soft light and the faint scent of old paper and lilacs. Everything in her home had a place, and everything in that place had a story. Grace had spent a lifetime building her world precisely that way, carefully, deliberately, and always alone. Her housekeeper had left hot tea on the table, untouched. The nurse would be back at noon. But in this moment, Grace was alone, and not uncomfortably so. She had always been comfortable in silence. It was people she had struggled with, especially the ones who claimed to know her. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the kind of thing that made doctors pause before they spoke. She hadn't cried, she didn't scream. Instead, she had thanked her doctor with the same grace she used at board meetings or charity galas, quietly, politely. Then she went home, sat in the same chair she sat in now, and let the weight of finality settle into her bones. Grace was not afraid of death. What unsettled her was something more subtle, more difficult to name, a sense that something had been left undone. Not a task, a truth, something buried so deep it had begun to feel imagined. She looked down at the writing desk beside her. A sheet of thick, cream-colored stationery lay in front of her, half filled with her looping script. Her handwriting wasn't what it used to be. The tremor in her right hand betrayed the poise she had once been known for, but the words came with surprising clarity. She was writing to a man named Jack Reynolds. She had only met him once, for less than an hour, on a night when the pain in her side had become too much, and she couldn't bear the idea of being alone. He had picked her up in a dusty silver Corolla, greeted her with a tired smile and a voice that had no pretense. She remembered thinking how strange it was to feel so safe in a stranger's car. They drove across the city, from Lakeshore Drive to the quiet streets of Evanston. She had asked questions, not out of politeness but from a need she didn't understand, and he had answered every one. Not with rehearsed lines or borrowed wisdom, but with something rarer: honesty. He had told her about his mother, about the years that slipped away, about the job he used to love, the brother he didn't speak to, the woman he let go because he couldn't give her what she deserved. There had been no bitterness in his voice, just weariness, the kind that settles into a person over time. She hadn't spoken much about herself. She didn't need to. She had seen in him what she once longed to see in herself, someone who still believed even just a little that life could turn out differently. Now, with the rain ticking softly against the glass, she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. No return address, no explanation, just a gesture, something quiet and irreversible. She didn't tell her attorney. She didn't tell the family who had spent the past 10 years circling her estate like vultures. She didn't owe them that. This letter wasn't about money. It wasn't about legacy. It was about a man who, in the briefest of moments, had reminded her that the heart still recognizes truth when it hears it, and that kindness, even when unnoticed, still matters. In less than 2 weeks, her will would be opened, and the letter would arrive at a small, one-bedroom townhouse on the far west side of Chicago. Jack Reynolds would open it, read it twice, sit with it in silence, and the life he thought was over would begin again. Not the peaceful kind that comes with still mornings or the hush of snowfall. His quiet was heavier. It lingered in the corners of rooms, stretched across long stretches of freeway, filled the space between questions no one asked anymore. For Jack, quiet was survival. It was what you learned to live with when the noise, ambition, love, purpose had drained out. He was 46, a rideshare driver. A night owl by necessity, not nature. His day began just as most people were winding theirs down. He drank his coffee in the kitchen while his mother napped in her recliner, the glow of late-night television flickering across her fragile features. Most nights she didn't wake when he left. Most mornings she didn't ask how things had gone, but he always checked in, left her water nearby, tucked a blanket around her legs like she used to do for him when he was a boy. They lived in a small house in Berwyn, one of those post-war neighborhoods outside Chicago where the mailboxes lean slightly and the sidewalks crack with winter's memory. Jack had moved back 4 years earlier after her second stroke. He told himself it would be temporary. He still told himself that, but the truth settled in over time, like dust in places no one bothers to clean. He kept a framed photo of himself from college on the mantel, back when he had a beard, a full head of hair, and a mind full of plans. He'd studied literature, dabbled in journalism. There was even a novel, half-finished on an old hard drive somewhere. People had told him he had a voice, something original. Back then, he believed them. Now, he drove. Nights were easier. People didn't expect conversation. The roads were open. The quiet, his old companion, was everywhere. He knew which gas stations stayed open past midnight, which streets stayed plowed, which neighborhoods tipped in cash. His phone was his compass: accept, pick up, drop off, repeat. He had learned to stop thinking in chapters. Now life came in rides: 12 minutes, 26 minutes, 41 minutes. Then the next. The night it happened, he almost didn't go out. It was a Wednesday in early November, and Chicago was wearing the kind of chill that gets into your bones. The heat in the house was inconsistent again, coughing out gusts of lukewarm air. His head ached faintly from lack of sleep, and the shift had already been slow. Just after 9, he considered turning the app off and calling it a night. But then the electric bill came to mind, and the property tax, and the medicine his mother needed. So he put on his worn denim jacket, filled his travel mug, and headed out into the cold. His first few rides were routine. A bartender heading home after closing. A nurse just off a double shift. A man too drunk to know he'd left his phone on the roof of the car. Jack moved through them all like a ghost. Present, efficient, invisible. At 9:42 p.m., his phone pinged with a new request. Pickup, Lakeshore Drive. Destination, Evanston. Passenger, Grace Whitmore. He paused. The name didn't register, but something about it lingered on the screen longer than most. He tapped Accept. It was a long ride, which meant good money, and the pickup point was in one of the most expensive buildings along the Gold Coast. Historic, elegant, the kind of place Jack only entered when someone needed a ride out of it. As he pulled up to the address, he took in the curved awning, the ornate brass door handles, the doorman in a navy coat and cap. Jack's Corolla didn't belong here, and he knew it. But he parked, waited, engine running, heater on low. The front doors opened and a woman stepped out. She moved slowly, not from frailty but from intention. Every step seemed measured, deliberate. She wore a gray wool coat with a belt tied neatly at the waist, gloves that looked like real leather, and a scarf with pale blue embroidery. Her hair was silver, not white, pinned up in a way that reminded him of old movies. She wasn't just elegant. She was composed, the way people are when they've had decades of practice. "You must be Jack," she said as she opened the back door. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. His voice was more formal than usual. She nodded, settled in, and buckled her seatbelt with surprising ease. "Thank you for being on time," she said. "Punctuality is rare these days." He offered a faint smile. "It's easier when there's nothing to be late for." That made her laugh. Not loudly, but with a kind of appreciation, like she hadn't expected to enjoy the ride. They drove in silence for the first few blocks. Jack kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. But then she spoke again. "Do you like your work, Jack?" It wasn't a question people asked him. Most didn't even learn his name. He hesitated. "It's fine. Pays the bills." She studied him in the rearview mirror. "That's not what I asked." He glanced at her reflection. Her eyes were sharp. Blue, maybe gray. "No," he said. "Not really. But it works for now." She nodded, like that answer satisfied her in some way. "I used to believe everything was temporary," she said softly, "until I realized my whole life had become one long compromise." The words hit harder than he expected. He didn't respond. She asked about his family. He told her about his mother, about the stroke, about his brother, Tom, who hadn't called in over a year, about the teaching job he left when things got too hard. She didn't interrupt, just listened. And when she spoke, it was only to ask questions that went a little deeper each time. By the time they reached her destination, a quiet, ivy-covered property in Evanston, the ride had become something else. Not therapy, not confession, but something more human than either. A shared moment between two people who didn't pretend to be more than they were. "Thank you, Jack," she said as she stepped out. "For the honesty. It's rare, even more than punctuality." He watched her walk to the door. Then he drove away, unsure of why his chest felt heavier than usual. He didn't know she would die within the week. He didn't know her name would appear in his mailbox, written in ink across a cream envelope with no return address. He didn't know that this ride, this woman, would upend everything he thought he understood about his past. That night, all he knew was that something about her stayed with him, and that for the first time in years, he wasn't quite ready to be alone with the silence. Jack didn't think of Grace Whitmore again for a couple of days. Not because he had forgotten her, he hadn't tea, but because real life tends to crowd out reflection when you were barely keeping things together. A conversation, no matter how meaningful, couldn't pay the gas bill or restock his mother's medication. And so, like he always did, Jack folded the night into memory and kept moving forward. Still, something lingered. Not her words exactly, but the feeling of them. The weight behind her questions. The way she'd looked at him. Not through him, like most people did, but at him. That had stayed. He found himself remembering her voice in odd moments, at red lights, in checkout lines, in the quiet space between dropping off a passenger and accepting the next ride. When someone asked how his night was going, he'd feel a pause inside, a brief hesitation before answering, as if the truth might escape if he didn't grab it in time. The letter arrived the following Saturday. The sky was low and gray, the kind of weather that pressed against your shoulders. Jack had just returned from picking up groceries and 2 prescriptions for his mother when he noticed it, tucked neatly between a pizza flyer and a medical bill. At first, he didn't think much of it. No return address. Handwritten. Classy envelope. Heavy, off-white, the kind that suggested something too expensive to throw away. He set it aside with the rest of the mail, but kept glancing at it as he unpacked the bags. Something about it didn't sit right. Or maybe it sat too right, like it had been waiting for him longer than he realized. Eventually, curiosity won. He washed his hands, dried them slowly, and opened the envelope. There was only 1 sheet inside. Thick, textured paper. His name written at the top in the same elegant cursive that had addressed the envelope. He scanned the first line and stopped. It was her. Grace Whitmore. Mr. Reynolds, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I wish I had more time. But then, don't we all? What I want you to know is simple. That night in your car meant more than you realized. You gave me honesty, not performance. And at this stage in my life, honesty is more valuable than all the wealth I spent decades trying to protect. My attorney will be in touch. Don't panic. You're not in trouble. But you are, in some small and unexpected way, part of something bigger now. I can't explain it all in this letter, not the family, the company, the history, but I can tell you this. You mattered. That night, you mattered. You reminded me of someone I once lost. Not in name, in spirit. And perhaps it's foolish of me, but I believe what we do with our final act says more about who we are than all the ones that came before. I hope this doesn't disrupt your life, but if it does, let it be the kind of disruption that leads to something worth finding. Warmly, Grace M. Whitmore. He read the letter twice before setting it down. Then he stood up, paced once around the kitchen, and read it again. Slower this time. There was nothing confusing about the words, but everything about the moment felt surreal. She was gone. That woman with the silk scarf, the quiet eyes, the questions that reached too deep. Gone. And she'd written him, a man she'd known for all of 40 minutes. The words weren't poetic. They weren't vague. They were precise and personal. She'd known what she was doing. This wasn't a whim. It was intention. Jack sat back down, leaned his elbows on the table, and let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. A feeling spread through his chest, uneasy and electric, like the moment before a storm hits. Part of him wanted to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a kind gesture. Maybe she wrote letters like this to many people. Maybe he was misreading everything. He'd done that before. Hope had never been particularly trustworthy. But part of him knew better. This woman didn't strike him as the type who did anything without meaning it, especially not when she knew her time was short. He looked at the envelope again, half expecting it to vanish. But it didn't. It was real. As real as the kitchen table beneath his hands. As real as the unpaid electric bill pinned to the fridge. A knock came at the door, just his neighbor bringing back a casserole dish. Jack mumbled a thank you and set it aside. The world continued, but something beneath it had shifted. That night, he didn't turn on the app, didn't work, didn't even leave the house. He sat in the living room, his mother asleep in the chair beside him, the hum of her oxygen machine rising and falling like a second breath. The letter rested on his lap. He looked out the window, past the streetlights, past the rows of quiet houses, and thought, what does it mean to matter to someone like her? And what the hell does she mean? You're part of something bigger now. He didn't know it yet, but by the next evening, a lawyer named Charles F. Langston would leave a voicemail on his phone. Calm, professional, with a tone that suggested Jack had just stepped into a world with rules he didn't want to understand. And nothing about his life, his quiet, invisible, measured life, would remain untouched. The voicemail came the next evening. Jack was finishing up washing the dinner dishes when he saw the missed call. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, Telemarketers were relentless these days, but then he noticed the transcript notification from his carrier. "Good evening, Mr. Reynolds. My name is Charles Langston. I represent the estate of Grace Whitmore. Please return my call at your earliest convenience. This is regarding a private matter of importance." He froze. The name echoed louder than it should have. Even though he knew the letter was real, had touched it, reread it, folded it into his coat pocket, it still felt like something fragile, like a dream that could vanish the second he said it out loud. Now, it wasn't just words on paper, it was official. Someone else knew. Someone from her world. He played the voicemail again, listening carefully this time. The voice was polished, well-educated, the kind of man who wore cufflinks without irony. Jack had heard men like that before, always in rooms he didn't belong in. After a few deep breaths, he returned the call. "Mr. Reynolds," came the answer, crisp and immediate. "Thank you for getting back to me. I understand this may come as a surprise. That's one word for it. I'd like to meet with you, in person, to explain the terms of Ms. Whitmore's testament. Would you be available tomorrow? I can come to you, if that's easier." The formality of it caught Jack off guard. I guess so. I'm home most mornings." "Excellent. 10 o'clock?" "Sure. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I'll see you then." Click. Jack set the phone down and stared at the counter. This was real. Someone had sent a lawyer, her lawyer, to talk to him. He suddenly felt underdressed for his own kitchen. What would he even wear to something like this? Did he need a lawyer of his own? What were the terms of a testament anyway? He hadn't touched anything remotely legal since a parking ticket in 2012. He barely slept that night. Dreams came in strange flashes. Long hallways, marble floors, people speaking in hushed voices, and Grace standing in a doorway, smiling but saying nothing. By morning, he had convinced himself this was probably ceremonial, some kind of symbolic gesture, a small donation in his name, maybe a book, a watch, something sentimental. That would make sense. At 9:58 a.m., a black Mercedes pulled up outside his house. The man who stepped out was tall, mid-50s in a tailored gray overcoat and scarf, briefcase in hand. His shoes didn't touch puddles. They stepped around them. Jack opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Langston," the man extended his hand. "Charles, please, call me Charles." They sat at the kitchen table. Jack had wiped it down twice, lit a candle, and cleared away his mother's pill bottles in a rush. She was sleeping in the next room. He offered coffee. Charles declined. He opened the briefcase, removed a leather folder, and placed it neatly on the table. "I'll get right to it. Ms. Whitmore updated her will shortly before her passing. In addition to her long-standing philanthropic designations and family disbursements, she included a new clause, one that names you, Mr. Reynolds, as a secondary beneficiary." Jack blinked. What?" Charles folded his hands. "In plain terms, you've been left something. A significant amount, in fact." Jack stared at him. "Significant how?" $750,000. The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the squeak of Jack's chair as he leaned back, stunned. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the squeak of Jackie's chair as he leaned back, stunned. That has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake. Miss Whitmore was clear. She described you as a man of humility, character, and, her words, rare substance. She also included a handwritten letter, which I'll leave with you." Charles pulled out a sealed envelope. Same cream paper, same handwriting. Jack didn't open it. He just held it in his hand, like it might break. "I don't understand," he said finally. "She didn't know me, not really. We talked. One time." Charles nodded. "I'm aware, and I've learned not to underestimate the weight of a single, meaningful exchange. Ms. Whitmore believed in acts of consequence, no matter how small." Jack sat in silence. After a moment, Charles continued. There's one more matter. The rest of the Whitmore family is being informed today. You should be prepared for the possibility of tension. Jack looked up. Tension. She had 2 surviving grandchildren, both of whom expected full inheritance rights. One in particular, Beatrice, holds executive power within Whitmore Holdings. She will not take this quietly. I don't want anything to do with some corporate drama, Jack said quickly. This money, it's too much. I mean, I appreciate the gesture, but— Mr. Reynolds, Charles interrupted, calmly but firmly, the money is already yours. Declining it would create more disruption than accepting it. It was her final wish. Respecting it is a form of closure. Jack exhaled slowly. I never asked for any of this. No, Charles said, but maybe that's why you were chosen. He gathered his documents, left a few legal forms with instructions, and stood. If you have any questions, please call me. I'll give you a few days to think. But be mindful. The media may catch wind. I'd suggest discretion. Jack walked him to the door, barely registering the handshake. When the car pulled away, he just stood there, the envelope still in his hand, heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear, awe, and something dangerously close to possibility. There was a time when Grace Whitmore wasn't anyone worth photographing. Not yet a benefactor. Not a figure of legacy. Not even a Whitmore, in the way society used the name. Long before the boardrooms, the art galas, and her carefully polished grace, she had simply been Grace Annell, the quiet daughter of a powerful man who only spoke in expectations and verdicts. She grew up in Lake Forest, Illinois, surrounded by cold marble and colder silences. Her father, Harold Annell, was one of the steel kings of the post-war Midwest, a man whose voice never rose, but whose decisions shaped entire cities. Her mother, Louisa, believed in the perfectness of appearances and the dangers of excess feeling. At dinner, emotion was considered bad taste. Passion was a foreign language no one cared to translate. Grace had learned early to hide her softness, to fold her curiosity into the pages of library books and her longing into quiet walks alone. In the spring of 1977, when she was 24, Grace met Daniel Cortez. He worked at one of the Whitmore-owned shipping yards, not in the offices, but on the floor. Calloused hands. Union badge. A laugh too loud for her world. They met by accident. She'd gone to the yard to collect a forgotten file. He was off shift and arguing with a vending machine. She made a comment. He made her laugh. It was nothing at first, but she returned the next day and the next. Not for paperwork. For him. He was nothing like the men her mother introduced her to. He spoke with conviction. He listened with his whole face. He kissed her like it meant something. She never told her parents. By August, she was pregnant. She knew before the test confirmed it. Something in her had already shifted. When her mother found out, by way of a calendar, a missed appointment, and the faintest of rumors, things moved swiftly. There were no screaming matches, no open betrayals, just plans. A private clinic in Madison. A medical retreat. Papers drawn up in her absence. The promise of anonymity and a life that would carry on uninterrupted. Grace hadn't wanted to give the child away, but wanting meant nothing in her house. Power made the rules, and shame was more dangerous than grief. The baby, a boy, was born just after sunrise on a Wednesday. No music, no father, no comfort. She was told not to hold him. "It will make it worse," the nurse said. But when the nurse turned away, she did. Just for a moment. Long enough to count 10 fingers, 10 toes. Long enough to trace the small cleft in his chin. Long enough for him to open his eyes, dark and searching, and meet hers. She whispered something then. Not a name. She hadn't been allowed to give him one. Just a promise. A trembling, silent vow spoken into his skin. "I'll remember you. I'll find a way to make this matter." And then he was gone. The adoption was closed. No updates, no photos. She was told it was final and complete, that it was cleaner this way. She returned to Chicago thinner, quieter. The official story was exhaustion. No one asked questions. That's how money worked. Her father died a year later. Her mother followed within the decade. The Whitmore estate, through a tangle of trusts and male cousins, landed unexpectedly in Grace's hands. She carried the name with discipline, not pride. She donated, built, smiled on cue, loved no one. And every year, on that Wednesday in late August, she lit a candle no one saw, for a boy without a name. In time, she tried to search, discreetly, quietly, but the adoption had been scrubbed from every record, hidden behind legal walls even her influence couldn't reach. So she stopped searching, but she never stopped wondering. Did he have a family? Did he feel loved? Did he wonder why? And then, one evening, she stepped into the back seat of a silver Corolla driven by a man named Jack Reynolds. Mid-40s, gentle voice, watchful eyes. He reminded her of someone she'd never met, but always remembered. He spoke of being raised by a single mother, a blank spot on his birth certificate, the feeling of walking through life like something was missing, even when he couldn't name it. She said very little, but inside, her hands trembled. It couldn't be. It probably wasn't. But what if it was? She would never ask. She had no right. But she knew one thing, and she knew it deeply. She couldn't let him leave her life without being seen. So she wrote him a letter, called her attorney, changed her will, not to reclaim, not to explain, but to leave something behind for the boy she'd once held and never forgot. And if it wasn't him, then she had still done the right thing, because no one should go through life never knowing that someone saw them, even just once, and chose to believe they were worth remembering. The weight of an unwanted spotlight. Jack had always lived between the lines. He was the type of man who made himself small in public, who stepped aside for others on crowded sidewalks, who learned to move through the world without drawing attention. He kept his receipts, said thank you, left a light on for his mother, and never made enough noise to be remembered. That life wasn't glamorous, but it had its own quiet dignity. Until now. The world, his world, no longer felt like his. It started with a single voicemail from a local reporter, then another, then a knock at the door from someone with a microphone and too much perfume. Jack turned them all away, but the silence didn't last. By midweek, the story had gone public. Anonymous rideshare driver named in Whitmore will. Photos surfaced, low-quality shots of him at a gas station, loading groceries into the trunk, escorting his mother in a wheelchair through a pharmacy parking lot. Places where he thought he was invisible. Now he was a curiosity, a question mark, an uninvited guest in someone else's empire. And behind the polite curiosity of journalists was something colder, speculation. Online forums filled with theories. Secret son? Illegitimate heir? Gold digger? Blackmail? Jack read the comments at 2 a.m., long after he should have closed his laptop. He stared at strangers dissecting his character like an open case file, calling him everything from a con man to a social experiment. One user wrote, "Nobody gets written into a billionaire's will after one Uber ride. There's more to this." The worst part was that Jack agreed. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't earned it. And yet it was happening. Charles Langston tried to calm him. Lay low. The cycle will shift. The press always moves on. But it didn't feel that simple. Not when the pressure was growing from the inside. Because then came her. Beatrice Whitmore. The name itself carried weight. Grace's granddaughter. High-profile CEO of Whitmore Holdings. Known for ruthless efficiency and lawsuits that never leaked to the press. She was the kind of person Jack had only ever seen in news segments or Forbes profiles. People who smiled with their teeth and measured affection in strategic silences. Her voice, when she called, was clear and cool, like a knife through water. "Mr. Reynolds, I assume you've been informed of my grandmother's unusual decision." He said nothing. "I'd like to meet. In person. You'll want to hear what I have to say." They met the next day at a downtown hotel, a private suite arranged by Charles. The curtains were drawn. No cameras, no microphones. Just a heavy mahogany table between two people from opposite lives. Beatrice entered first. She wore a black wool coat over a gray cashmere turtleneck, no jewelry except a slim silver watch. Her hair was pulled back into a precise bun. Her eyes, though, were sharp and unyielding. Jack felt underdressed in jeans and a blazer that hadn't fit right since 2015. She didn't sit right away. She studied him, his posture, his hands, his expression, as though trying to identify a weakness before she spoke. "I'll make this brief," she said, finally taking the seat across from him. "My family's estate has been private for 4 generations. My grandmother spent her life guarding that legacy. So imagine my reaction when I'm informed that a stranger, someone with no record, no bloodline, no stake, is suddenly carved into our future." Jack exhaled slowly. "I didn't ask for this. I gave her a ride. That's it." "Then give it back." "What?" "The inheritance, the money, the exposure, all of it. Walk away and we'll forget this ever happened." He stared at her. "I don't want your family's money," he said, "but I'm not sure it's yours to take back." Her jaw tightened. "You really believe she chose you because of you? You think a conversation in a car made you special?" "No," Jack replied, "but I think maybe it made her feel something she hadn't in a long time, and maybe that was enough for her." She paused, just long enough for a flicker of emotion to pass over her face. Surprise, maybe, or something older. Then it was gone. "There's a history you don't understand," she said. "A lot of damage beneath the surface of this family. Be careful where you stand. You might already be on a fault line." Jack leaned forward. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. There are people in my world who don't like loose ends, and they're starting to wonder who you really are." He stood up. "So am I." She didn't respond, but just before she left, she turned back and said, "She kept your photo. From the security camera in her building. She had it printed, framed, set it on her writing desk." Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, he sat in the dark with the framed letter on his lap, staring at his reflection in the window. He looked like the same man he'd always been. But maybe he wasn't. Maybe Grace hadn't chosen him despite who he was, but because of it. And maybe the truth wasn't just waiting to be found. Maybe it had always been circling back to him. The questions that don't let go. Jack didn't sleep much after the meeting with Beatrice. He lay in bed, staring at the cracks in his ceiling, the letter from Grace still on his nightstand, now joined by a new kind of silence. The kind that comes when a person realizes they've just been handed the key to a door they've spent their whole life pretending didn't exist. He couldn't stop thinking about what Beatrice had said. "There's a history you don't understand. Are you the missing son Grace gave up for adoption? She kept your photo. It was ridiculous, absurd, and yet it wasn't. Because there was a blank space in his story. A quiet omission that he'd stopped questioning long ago. Jack had grown up with only one version of his life, a single mother who worked 2 jobs and never talked about the man who helped bring him into the world. There had never been a photo, a name, a letter, just empty air where a father might have stood. When he was 12, he had asked. They were sitting in the kitchen, his mother making scrambled eggs, the radio humming low. He asked casually, almost like a joke, "Was my dad a soldier or a spy?" She didn't laugh. She just looked out the window and said, "He was young, and it wasn't the right time." That was all. He never asked again. Now, decades later, the silence returned. Only this time, it felt like a lie. The next morning, Jack found himself standing in front of a plastic storage bin in his bedroom closet. The one filled with old paperwork, expired car insurance policies, a college transcript he'd never finished. He dug until he found the faded manila envelope labeled Jack Birth. Inside, a copy of his birth certificate, brittle from age. Mother, Carol Reynolds. Father, blank. He stared at it for a long time, as if the name might appear if he squinted hard enough. It didn't. That afternoon, he made a call to a friend from his community college days, Len, who now worked in a county clerk's office. "Do you think it's possible to unseal a closed adoption?" Len hesitated. "Maybe. Depends on the state, the year, and if there's cause." "What kind of cause?" "Biological relevance, inheritance disputes, medical necessity. You thinking about digging something up?" Jack paused. "Something's already digging me." The first person he spoke to was his mother. Carol sat in her recliner, the oxygen machine humming softly beside her, the news on mute. Her eyes were tired but clear. He sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing her directly, holding her hand. "Mom," he said gently, "I need to ask you something about my father." She didn't flinch. That worried him more than anything. "I know you didn't want to talk about it before, and I never pushed, but something's happening. Something strange. And I need to know if you were ever in contact with the Whitmore family." At the sound of that name, her eyes shifted. She didn't look surprised. "I gave you what I could," she said, her voice weak but steady. "I didn't have a name. I didn't ask for one." "What do you mean?" She looked past him now, as if watching some memory flicker on the wall. "I was young, working part-time at a clinic in Evanston, filing charts, taking blood pressure. There was this woman. She came in quiet, classy, rich, you could tell, but scared. I think she was there to see someone privately, one of those hush-hush doctors the upper crust used when they didn't want questions." Jack leaned in. "One day," she continued, "I was sent to deliver paperwork to her. She looked devastated, like someone who'd made peace with something no one should have to accept. I asked if she needed water. She asked me if I had kids. I said no." Her breath caught. She said, "Then you still have room for one more." Jack didn't breathe. "She left 2 days later. I never saw her again. But I got a call from the clinic director. Said something had been arranged. Said a child had been born. That it had been legally cleared. No name, no trace. They asked me if I wanted to adopt. Quietly. No fees, no press." Jack whispered. "You said yes." She nodded. "I didn't know where he came from. I didn't ask. I was lonely, tired, and I believed it was fate." He didn't speak for a long time. Then, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because love, Jack, doesn't always come with explanations, and because part of me hoped it would never matter." He stood, slowly, as though the floor beneath him might shift. Everything was different now. He called Charles that evening. "There's a chance," Jack said, "that I might actually be part of her family." Charles didn't respond immediately. "That changes things," he finally said. "Not legally, yet, but it changes the way we move forward. You think Beatrice knows? If she didn't before, she will soon. This isn't just inheritance now. It's bloodline, and that means war." Jack didn't like the sound of that. He was no warrior. He was just a man trying to understand why his life had always felt paused. But now, something inside him had shifted. The letter, the photo, the inheritance, the silence his mother had carried for decades, the strangers who suddenly wanted to know everything about him. It was all part of the same story. And for the first time in his life, Jack Reynolds didn't want to disappear. He wanted to know. The DNA and the boardroom. The day the test results arrived, Jack didn't open the email right away. He sat alone in the kitchen, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating a face that barely recognized itself anymore. There was something cruel in how the truth waited for him. Tidy, clinical, sealed behind a subject line that lacked any sense of the storm it carried. Your DNA relationship results are now available. One click. That's all it would take. Jack had lived his life with unanswered questions folded tightly into quiet places. Places he never went, not even in his thoughts. But now, someone had given those questions a spotlight, and in a few seconds he'd see whether or not everything he suspected, feared, maybe even hoped was true. When he finally clicked, the document loaded quickly. Probability of maternity: 99.99987% Grace Whitmore, biological mother relationship confirmed. It was the kind of message you might miss if you scrolled too fast, but Jack didn't scroll. He sat frozen, reading the line over and over. Grace Whitmore hadn't just been a kind woman who'd seen something in him. She was his mother. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, not spiritually, but genetically, unequivocally. She had given birth to him, then given him away. And now, years later, she'd reached back from the grave to say, "I see you." He pushed the chair back from the table and walked outside. The Chicago wind sliced across his skin, but he welcomed it. He needed something sharp to remind him he was still here, still standing. For the first time in his life, the question that had always lingered silently behind his eyes, "Where do I come from?" had an answer. And yet, instead of clarity, it brought more dissonance. Charles Langston called later that afternoon. "She knew, didn't she?" Jack asked before the lawyer could speak. "She did," Charles replied. "She didn't tell me outright, but she left instructions. She asked that the truth come to you only if you were ready to receive it. She wanted the moment to be yours, not hers." Jack exhaled. She had no right to make that call. No, but she also had no way to undo what was already done. There was a pause. Charles's voice softened. "There's another matter. The Whitmore board has asked to meet you. Officially." Jack felt the words settle like sand in his stomach. "They want to know what to do with me. They want to know if you're a threat." Jack nearly laughed. "A threat to what? Their corporate empire. I'm a guy who still budgets for toilet paper. But now you have a name they've spent generations protecting." Jack was silent. Charles continued. "They'll want to size you up. See if you fit their world or if they need to contain you. I don't want their world. Doesn't matter. You're in it now." The Whitmore Holdings boardroom was perched like a throne room above downtown Chicago. Sleek, glass-walled, clinically elegant. Everything smelled like leather and wealth. The kind of wealth that didn't talk about money. It assumed it. Jack stepped in wearing a suit Charles had arranged. Gray wool, slightly stiff, but fitted. He looked like someone else. Someone prepared, someone manufactured. But inside, Jack felt raw, unguarded. Across the table sat Beatrice Whitmore, surrounded by 5 board members. 2 women, 3 men, all middle-aged or older, all watching him with careful, measured gazes. They had the polite expressions of people trained to tolerate discomfort until it stopped costing money. Beatrice sat with her hands folded neatly on the table. No jewelry, no makeup, no excess. She was an executive down to the muscle fibers. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reynolds," she said. "You insisted," Jack replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Beatrice's mouth twitched, just barely. "We're all adjusting to new realities. Grace left, unresolved matters, and we are the ones left to deal with them." "Unresolved matters," Jack echoed. "That what I am to you?" "It's what you are to this company." Jack let the silence stretch a little. One of the board members, Denton Maris, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reynolds, let's get to the point. Grace included you in her estate. That's her right. But now that DNA results have confirmed a biological link, your presence becomes more than personal. It becomes institutional, and that complicates things." "I didn't ask to be in your institution," Jack said. "I didn't even know I had a mother until a month ago." "That doesn't change what you are now," Beatrice said. "In the public's eyes, you're a Whitmore, and we live or die by perception." Jack looked around the table, suddenly aware that he wasn't the only one who'd lost control of something. "I'm not here to take your company," he said. "I'm not here to claim board seats or stock or decision-making power." "Then what are you here for?" Beatrice asked. Jack paused, then replied, "To understand why she chose to leave me, and why she chose to bring me back." A hush followed. Beatrice broke it. "Let me ask you something," she said, voice quieter now. "What would you have done if she'd told you? 20 years ago? 30? "I don't know," Jack admitted, "but maybe I'd have asked her why she gave me away without even leaving her name." "She was 24, Beatrice said almost to herself, under her father's thumb, pregnant by a man the family didn't approve of. She didn't get to make clean choices." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You knew?" "I suspected. She left me letters too, just not all of them made sense until now." "And now?" Beatrice looked at him, long and level. "Now I'm looking at my uncle." The room went still. Jack blinked. "That's not how I ever imagined being introduced." Beatrice smirked. "Welcome to the family." For the first time, the tension didn't feel like ice. It felt like ground shifting beneath his feet. The turning point. In the days that followed the boardroom meeting, Jack felt as if he were living two lives at once. In one, he was still the man who drove a Corolla through Chicago's coldest hours, who waited in pharmacy lines, who sat beside his mother as she slept and monitored oxygen levels. That man still sorted through bills with careful fingers and used coupons for groceries. In the other life, the one that had appeared uninvited, he was Jack Whitmore, son of Grace, heir to a fortune, curiosity of the media, and unexpected fracture in a legacy too clean for the truth. He wasn't sure which version of himself was real, or worse, if both were. He took long walks, through neighborhoods that still smelled like his childhood and through ones that never welcomed him before. He saw himself reflected in windows. Not quite wealthy, not quite invisible. Suspended between worlds. But something else had changed, too. Beatrice had started texting him. Short, efficient messages at first. "Board agreed to keep your involvement quiet for now. PR team working on a narrative. There's a legal trust review next week. You'll be listed. I sent you a copy of the original will. It's worth reading." And then, one night, just after 9 p.m., she wrote, "Are you free for dinner? Nothing formal, just questions." He almost said no. He was tired, and there was a part of him that still didn't trust her. Not entirely. But he also knew that some truths could only be reached through uncomfortable conversations. And he had spent his whole life avoiding those. So he said yes. They met at a quiet restaurant tucked into a side street in Lincoln Park. No photographers, no shareholders, no last names. She was already seated when he arrived. No coat, no armor, just a glass of wine and a notebook she hadn't opened. "You look tired," she said. "You look like you don't get tired." That made her laugh, genuinely. The server brought water. They both ignored the menus. "I didn't think you'd say yes," she admitted. "I almost didn't." "Why did you?" Jack shrugged. "Because I'm tired of not knowing who I am." Beatrice looked down. "You know, when I was 12, I asked her about the portrait in her study, the one of her as a young woman. I said, 'You look lonely in that picture.' She said, 'That was the last day I wasn't.'" Jack sat back. The words sat between them like fog. "She never talked about him?" he asked. "The man? My father?" Beatrice shook her head. "Not to me. And believe me, I asked." Jack had imagined 100 stories, affairs, scandals, young love, all of them equally plausible, all of them equally incomplete. "I think she was ashamed," Beatrice added. "Not of you, but of what it cost her." Jack nodded slowly. "She thought I'd hate her for it." "Would you have?" He didn't answer right away. "Maybe, for a while. But now? No, I think I would have hated not knowing more." She studied him. "You're not who I expected." "Neither are you." When they stepped outside, the air had turned sharper. Streetlights cast long shadows. Beatrice turned to face him. "I don't think you should disappear," she said. "Is that a business recommendation or a personal one?" "Both," he smirked. "You sound like her." "I hope so," she said. "But I'm not trying to be her." She paused. "You could join the foundation." Jack raised an eyebrow. "I'm not exactly corporate material." "It's not about suits, it's about story, and you have one." He didn't answer right away. His heart was still in two places, the quiet life he'd built out of necessity, and the complicated, louder one that was calling to him now, not for power, but for meaning. He looked up at the sky. "I don't know if I want to be part of this family," he said, "but I think I need to find out what kind of man she thought I could be." Beatrice nodded. "Then do it for her, or for you, but don't do it halfway." She walked toward her car, then stopped and turned back. "Just so you know," she said, "I was angry at first. Furious, actually. But I see it now." "See what?" "She didn't leave you money. She left you a reckoning. And you're the only one strong enough to carry it." Jack didn't speak. He just watched as she disappeared into the dark. That night he wrote a letter. To no one. To everyone. To her. He wrote about long nights, about silence, about loneliness and small acts of kindness. He wrote about the weight of not knowing, about the surprise of being chosen, about the feeling of finally seeing your own reflection not in a mirror, but in someone else's memory. He wrote until his hand ached. Then he folded the paper and placed it inside the original envelope Grace had sent him, and for the first time, he felt the weight of it change. Weeks later, Jack stood at the head of a small auditorium inside the Whitmore Foundation building. He wore no tie, just a simple blazer. His voice was steady, not rehearsed, but honest. "I was just a driver," he said, "but that's not what made her choose me. She didn't choose me because I said something brilliant, or because I reminded her of herself. She chose me because I listened, because I saw her." He looked out at the faces, staff, press, partners, strangers, and now I see all of this, not as an inheritance, but as a chance to rewrite what it means to belong. He paused. "And that begins with listening, to the people we ignore, to the ones who feel invisible, because sometimes the most important lives don't announce themselves. They arrive in silence, and they change everything." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dried leaves across the pavement. Jack stood quietly, breathing in the evening air. He wasn't driving tonight. He wasn't running anymore either. He was simply here, and, for the first time, he belonged. The man he chose to become. 2 months had passed since Jack had stepped onto that small foundation stage and spoken aloud the story he never thought he'd live. Muito menos contar. Since so, time hadn't moved faster or slower, just differently. Moved faster or slower, just differently. Like a river whose current had shifted course without changing speed. He still lived in Berwyn. Still wore the same beat-up boots in winter. Still helped his mother into her chair every morning and made her tea just the way she liked it. Too much lemon, no sugar. Life didn't become glossy or grand just because the world had shifted its attention. But something had taken root inside him. Something steady. Something that gave shape to the space that had always felt hollow. Purpose. At the Whitmore Foundation, Jack found himself in a position he never asked for, and had no title to match. He wasn't executive director or vice president of strategic initiatives. He was simply Jack. But over time, that name, one he used to feel unworthy of, began to mean something new inside those walls. He became known not for making decisions, but for asking the questions no one else thought to ask. Who's this actually helping? Has anyone asked them what they need? What would Grace think if she were here? Staff members started turning to him for input, not out of obligation, but respect. He was the only person in the room who hadn't grown up in rooms like that, and that was exactly what made his presence powerful. He didn't try to impress, he tried to connect. When the foundation board pushed back on funding a youth shelter near Englewood, citing crime concerns, Jack scheduled a visit. Not a Zoom, not a press tour. A real visit. He sat on folding chairs with the staff, listened to stories from teenage mothers and boys who aged out of foster care without a safety net. Then he returned to the board and didn't just argue, he described. Faces, voices, fears. The funding passed. Later, one of the board members said quietly, "You have a way of making people visible." Jack nodded. So did Grace. Still, he never stopped being Jack Reynolds. He drove sometimes, not for money, but for rhythm, for solitude. He kept the Corolla, polished the dashboard, updated the GPS but kept the seat fabric torn, just the way it had always been. He said it helped him think, and the truth was, it helped him stay. Because the foundation, with its boardrooms and event galas and donor language, could pull a man upward so fast he forgot what the sidewalk felt like. And Jack never wanted to forget that. It was the sidewalk, after all, that raised him. One cold morning, he drove alone to the cemetery. He hadn't gone back since the day of the funeral. He didn't believe in talking to stones or making peace through granite, but something in him said it was time. The grave was quiet, tucked under a tree that hadn't yet lost all its leaves. The headstone was modest for someone of her stature. Another decision Jack suspected had been made long before her death. Grace Annell Whitmore, 1953-2024. She listened. Jack stood there for a long time, not waiting for a sign, not expecting some cinematic rush of forgiveness. Just standing. "I get it now," he said finally. "Why you did it this way. Why you couldn't say it out loud." He brushed his hand over the top of the stone. "I still wish you had." He didn't cry. He didn't feel the need to. The grief had changed. Not softer, not easier, just quieter. Like something you carry, not something you fight. Back home, his mother had good days and bad days. On the good ones, they played music. She liked old jazz. Ella, Miles, Coltrane. Jack would sway her gently in the living room, her feet barely moving, her weight leaning on him like when he was a boy. On the bad days, he read to her. Anything with rhythm and memory, poetry, psalms, recipes from her old cookbook. One afternoon, as he sat beside her, she reached out and touched his cheek. "You came back," she whispered. "I never left." Her eyes filled, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled, full and deep. He stayed there, holding her hand, knowing the moment would pass, as all moments do. But this one would leave something behind. A root, a memory, a piece of home that nothing, not money, not blood, not time, could take from him now. A life that looks forward. The Whitmore Foundation had a new wall. It wasn't made of plaques or gilded names. It wasn't about donors or ribbon cuttings. It was a gallery of portraits, black and white, unretouched, faces of people the foundation had served, faces that once went unseen. Under each photo was no more than a name and a line, something they said in passing, a memory, a hope, a truth too plain for headlines. It was Jack's idea. Beatrice had been skeptical at first. "We can't build stories around sentimentality," she'd said, but Jack had stood his ground. "We can, if those stories are real, and they're all real." So she let him try. Within weeks, the effect was undeniable. Interns and visitors stopped. Staff began using first names from the wall in meetings. Funders asked questions that weren't on the agenda. Something had shifted. People were no longer data points. They were people, and the foundation, long defined by its numbers, began remembering what Grace had, perhaps, once forgotten in her own rise, that the most powerful currency is not money, but recognition. Jack didn't speak at every board meeting. He didn't want to. He had no desire to become an executive or a public figure. He was there to make sure the silence didn't return, the same silence that had followed him for most of his life, the kind that hides in heritage, in shame, in wealth, in absence. Now, when he spoke, people leaned in, because when Jack spoke, it wasn't to perform. It was to remind them that someone's entire life can hinge on one decision made in a moment no one else noticed, like a car ride. One Thursday, he got a message from Beatrice. "You free tomorrow night?" "Depends. What's up?" "I want to show you something." She picked him up in a clean black SUV. No driver, no assistants. They drove for nearly an hour without saying much until they pulled up in front of a modest building in the West Loop. It looked like an old school or a church, something built when things were made to last. "What is this?" Jack asked. She smiled. "A new thing, built on an old idea." Inside, the walls were bare, but the space breathed like something waiting to be filled. A small stage, a few folding chairs, a row of bookshelves. "It's called the listening room," she said. "A space for people to tell stories, real ones, nothing curated, no agenda, just the truth." Jack looked around. The air felt like something he remembered, though he couldn't name it. "I want you to help lead it," she added. "Just once a month. You don't have to plan anything. Just show up. Keep people honest. Keep the room honest." He didn't answer right away. She turned to him. "You said you didn't want a seat at the table. Fine. So build a new one." That night he agreed. In the months that followed, Jack became something he never expected. A constant. Not famous, not loud, just steady. He hosted nights at the listening room. He worked quietly at the foundation. He took care of his mother. And he made time for the things that made him feel whole. Jazz records, long drives, cheap coffee with real conversation. People stopped asking if he was really a Whitmore. They started asking how they could help. Sometimes strangers would stop him, tell him they'd seen his speech, or read about the letter, or heard about how he sat with a grieving father for 2 hours after a grant decision went sideways. He always said the same thing. It wasn't just me, it was her too. One late fall afternoon, Jack received a ride request through the app. He hadn't turned it on in weeks, maybe longer, but that day, for no reason he could explain, he had. The pickup was nearby. The name was just Ben. When Jack pulled up, a young man in his 20s stepped in, hoodie pulled low, backpack on his lap. He looked lost. Not directionally, emotionally. Jack had seen that look 100 times. He knew it by heart. "Where we headed?" Jack asked. "North Side," the kid said, not really in a rush. They drove in silence for a while. The kid stared out the window. Jack glanced in the mirror. "Tough week?" he asked. The kid hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Jack didn't pry. After a minute, the kid said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you think one decision can change your whole life?" Jack smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I do," he said. "I think sometimes all it takes is one conversation with the right person at the right time." The kid didn't say anything, but his shoulders relaxed a little. The silence softened. As they pulled up to the destination, the kid looked back. "Thanks, man. Seriously." Jack nodded. "Any time." The door closed, and for a moment, Jack sat still. The world outside moved as it always did, full of sound, full of speed. But inside that car, there was space. Space enough for someone else's life to begin again. And maybe, just maybe, that's all he was ever meant to be. Not a billionaire, not a legacy, but a beginning. The last ride. It was a Sunday morning in late spring when Jack decided to drive again. Really drive. Not for a quick errand or a quiet hour to think. Not to escape or process. But because, somehow, after all this time, it still grounded him. He took the long way through the North Side, past the parks just waking with joggers, the cafes setting out chairs, the city stirring in quiet layers. The windows were down, the air smelled like lilac and old pavement. The app was off. This wasn't work. This was something closer to a ritual, a return to rhythm. He turned on the radio. A Coltrane solo drifted out, nothing too melancholy, just warm enough to follow. At a red light, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, a habit he never lost. It used to be just for safety. Then it became something else, a reminder that someone was always there, watching, even if silently. Grace had taught him that, with her presence, with her absence. That mirror, he thought, had once shown him a woman he didn't know was his mother. Now it showed him someone else entirely, himself. He pulled into a quiet overlook near Montrose Harbor. The lake was calm, a soft silver under morning clouds. Sailboats drifted slowly, as if unsure whether to leave or stay. Jack stepped out and stood by the railing. He took from his jacket a letter, yellowed slightly, folded twice. Her letter, the first one. He'd carried it with him often over the last year. Not always physically, but always in spirit. The weight of it had changed. It no longer pressed down. It held steady, like a memory that asks to be honored, not relived. He read it again, silently. Then, slowly, he unfolded a second sheet, one he'd written weeks ago, but never mailed. It wasn't long, just a few lines. I never needed an empire. I just needed to be seen. Thank you for doing that, even from a distance. I see you now, too. He folded both letters together, placed them inside a small envelope, and tucked it beneath a stone near the edge of the water. Not for ceremony, not for spectacle. Just to let it go, gently. Some stories, he realized, don't need to be shouted. They only need to be finished. He returned to the car and sat quietly for a few minutes, letting the engine idle. Across the parking lot, a family loaded into a minivan. Laughter, chaos, movement, a life in full swing. Jack smiled. He didn't envy it. He didn't long for what he'd missed. He had his own fullness now. One built not on inheritance or answers, but on presence. On being where he was, with the people who mattered, doing things that made the silence feel less empty. His phone buzzed, a message from Beatrice. "Lunch this week? Dad wants to meet you." He let the message sit for a moment, then replied, "Yeah, let's do it." As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced once more in the mirror. This time, he didn't expect to see anyone there, but he looked anyway, and smiled. Because once, just once, someone had sat in that seat and looked at him like he was more than a driver, more than a man, more than what the world had told him he could be. She had seen him, and he had seen her. And from that simple, fleeting exchange, something extraordinary had grown. Not a fortune, not a legacy, but a life. And that, Jack knew now, was more than enough. After everything Jack went through, the unexpected inheritance, the identity crisis, the silent truths, and the lives touched along the way, we have to ask ourselves, what would you have done in his place? Would you have walked away from the money, or embraced the truth that came with it? Have you ever met someone, even briefly, who changed the entire direction of your life? And more importantly, have you ever felt unseen, only to be recognized by someone at exactly the right moment? We want to hear from you. What moment from Jack's story hit closest to home? Was it the discovery of his roots? The silent courage of Grace? The dinner with Beatrice? Or maybe that final ride where he passed on to someone else what was once given to him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else. And if this journey moved you in any way, don't forget to follow our channel. We bring you more real, emotional, and thought-provoking stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Until next time, remember, sometimes all it takes is one unexpected conversation to change everything.